Kentucky Route Zero is a special game. So special, in fact, that I need to talk over the spoiler warning. This game is an experience unlike any other. A beautifully well-crafted blend of genres and mediums that results in one of the most densely thematic works of art I've ever seen in my life. And like any great work, it's something that cannot be told to you, assuming you want to experience it in its intended form. So in that way, I can give this game an unequivocal recommendation. However, when I look at it pragmatically, Kentucky Route Zero seems to be designed for a specific type of player. A player with a lot of patience who is ready to read a short novel's worth of dialogue, along with being prepared to synthesize its entirety once it has come to a close. To put it into perspective, according to Steam achievements, a higher percentage of the owners of Dark Souls Remastered have seen the ending of that game, compared to the lower percentage of players who have completed just the first of Kentucky Route Zero's 5 acts. Dark Souls, a game renowned for its difficulty, has had a higher portion of its players reach its ending than this point-and-click adventure game with extremely simple puzzles that even includes built-in ways to skip some of them. The point is that this game is extremely slow-paced, which seems to be off-putting to the vast majority of people who put down their money to buy it. So I can't say with certainty that you should drop this video right now and instead drop your time and money on this game first. It is very likely that you will bounce right off it. But at the same time, I will, in this video, go on to argue that the individual's experience of this game's events is key to its underlying message. But regardless of whether or not you've played the game or not, my only hope is that I can communicate what I found so intriguing about this game, and more importantly, what I think it's about. To start, I'll give a synopsis of the most important plot points throughout the game, which won't take too long considering how sparsely populated the plot really is in terms of these critical points of interest. If you've played through the game already, you can skip this part if you want. So let's begin with Act 1. The game begins with our first character of focus, Conway, making one final delivery for a failing antique shop. Though the address he's delivering to, 5 Dogwood Drive, doesn't seem to be anywhere on any map, so he makes a stop at a gas station to find that he needs to go to the Zero. He doesn't seem to know that road either, so he's sent off seeking Weaver Marquez for further directions. Weaver points him towards an off-ramp to the east as a good place to find it. Conway doesn't find the Zero here, though he does find Shannon Marquez, Weaver's cousin. They descend into an abandoned mine in search of both the Zero, as well as something Weaver told Shannon she would find in this mine. But when a cave-in occurs because of their tampering with an old intercom system, Conway's leg gets injured, though they do still make it out safely thanks to the tramway that was left in the mine. They both get back on the road in search of the Zero once again, a search which leads them back to the Marquez farmhouse. Act 2 begins at a location along the Zero, the Bureau of Reclaimed Spaces, which repurposes old sites like graveyards and cathedrals for new purposes. Because of this, they also keep track of addresses, which is of particular interest to Conway since it might help him find this Dogwood Drive he's looking for. This sends him and Shannon around loops of bureaucracy and eventually to retrieve paperwork from an old storage site. But it's around this time that Conway's injury from the cave-in seems to get worse, which prompts a visit to a nearby doctor. The people from the bureau say that the doctor is at an address along the surface roads, but this doesn't seem to necessarily be the case, as is explained by Ezra, a kid found in the museum at the given address. The people living in this museum live as exhibits, but they're taken by Ezra's brother to a nearby forest to sleep before being taken back in the morning. And so, the three of them are taken by Ezra's brother to see the doctor.
Black smoke's arising and it surely is a train. Surely is a train, boys, surely is a train. Black smoke.
Act 3 begins with the aftermath of Conway's treatment, which seems to be more of a new leg rather than a fixed one. Afterwards, they're brought back to the museum so everyone, now including Ezra, can get back on the road, though it doesn't last long. As the group is now stranded out on the side of the road, the game introduces Junebug and Johnny, a couple of traveling musicians on their way to a performance, and they fix Conway's truck given that they'll attend their performance. They agree, attend the performance at an old failing bar, and the bartender gives them directions back to the Zero. Junebug and Johnny decide to follow them wherever they're going. However, rather than quickly arriving back at the Bureau, they instead find the Hall of the Mountain King, where a man named Donald began to develop a game called Xanadu, though the computer the game runs on is non-functional at the moment. The group is sent to find the Strangers, who allegedly put Donald's computer into disrepair. Conway and Shannon find the fix, though they're obviously shaken up by whatever happened off-screen. Back at the hall, Xanadu tells the story of its own creation, of Donald descending into the cave with his crew and developing the game itself. It ends with an event which immediately occurs outside the game, one of Donald's original assistants visiting just now, long after abandoning the project. She gives the group directions back to the Bureau and sets them back on the road. When they return to the Bureau, the address of 5 Dogwood Drive has been crunched and located. They can reach it by going down the Echo River. While they wait for their ride, Conway recounts their encounter with the strangers they had off-screen. He took a moment to calm down and talk to Shannon before something strange happened. The people running this distillery are faceless and formless, prepared to offer Conway an entrance into their ranks. He's given a tour of the facility and the truck he would drive, and eventually given a drink to initiate him into his new job. When Conway refuses the job, his tour guide tells him that he'll be forced to work anyway, since giving the tour and the initiation are so expensive. Conway mulls over his sudden new fate as their ride to the Echo River arrives. Act 4 is the least eventful act in the game. It consists of several disconnected vignettes showing the lives of the people who live along the Echo River. However, what is arguably one of the game's most important events also happens. Throughout the scenes that make up this act, you can notice Conway making contact with the people from the distillery, first at the rum colony, then at the dock at the Radvansky Center, and finally while going through the Bat Sanctuary to deliver a package for the owners of the boat. Then, after Shannon talks to the person that package is for, Conway is taken from them. A disturbed Shannon drives back to the boat, to a restaurant they're stopping at. She hardly makes an attempt at conversation. Eventually, she finds an excuse to go back on board.
This world is not my home. I'm just passing through. My treasures and my hopes are placed beyond the blue. Many friends and kin have gone on before, and I can't feel at home in this world anymore.
Shortly after this, the boat finally reaches its destination, the Silo of Light Reflections. All the characters who have come this far pitch in to bring the antiques up the long and winding stairs, where they will hopefully arrive at 5 Dogwood Drive. Act 5 takes place in a town, which was hit by a brutal storm just the night before. This resulted in the deaths of 2 horses that the members of the town held dear, the neighbors as they call them. As such, they prepare for a proper burial. This is also when Shannon and her group arrive, looking for 5 Dogwood Drive, which they find to be a colorless and bare yet large and comforting structure, which was allegedly only just erected the previous day with no owner. From here, the game essentially has its victory lap, with many conversations to follow between each character who made it to the end. It all ends with the neighbor's burial.
I've heard of a land of joy and peace and wonderful life, a beautiful place of mansions fair and skies so bright, where all who believe the Savior dear forever shall stay. And having been saved by grace divine, I'm going that way. I'm going that way. I'm going that way. Yes, dear, the Savior I adore is with me each day. I'm clinging to Him and never to stray, just singing praises all day long. I'm going that way.
I'd like to preface the rest of this video by explaining exactly why I went through an entire plot synopsis, and it's because I've been leading up to this important establishing concept. One of the many ways you can categorize almost any story ever told is by its base focuses. While I can't say this for certain, I'd say that the vast majority of all stories are defined by how much or how little they lean into these three focuses. The first focus is the plot, defined by the world the story takes place in and the story's major revelatory events. Oftentimes, these stories are built around a major twist which recontextualizes the journey that the characters of focus undertake throughout the story's runtime. Another possible focus is the characters, which is fairly self-explanatory. The focus of these stories is usually on developing its cast and the cast's relationship to each other, or it can be a character study, a deep dive into the mind and inner workings of a single character. And the final possible focus is theme, where every facet of a story is built up as allegorical or reflective of something in the real world. When a story has something to say, that is built on its themes, and while every story has one, those with this sort of focus are meticulously built around whatever its major themes are. Ideally, every moment of a story has a purpose, and that purpose is to advance one or more of these three aspects: plot, character, and theme. Now, we can apply this to Kentucky Route Zero. As you may guess, the game's plot seems to be of lesser importance compared to the other aspects, which becomes apparent once you begin to think of the plot's many contrivances and how many mysteries it allows to go unsolved. For some examples, is Weaver a sort of ghost, or is she really alive? It's very convenient that she was there to give Conway directions to the off-ramp, and then abruptly disappear from the room shortly after. Who is Julian? Why is he a giant bird? Is he really Ezra's brother? Again, it's very convenient that there's a way to get the group over to the forest to see the doctor. Why does the car stop in this spot of all the times it could have? The answer is out of convenience, so that the group can meet Junebug and Johnny. How is Xanadu able to tell the future? Whatever technology it works on should be incredibly valuable. There's also the trio that are found in the basement of the gas station, Emily, Bob, and Ben, who disappear after asking Conway to find the dye for their game. They also show up in Act 5 as residents of the town. Are they also just ghosts like Weaver? And there is, of course, the house at 5 Dogwood Drive, which was allegedly built yesterday during a storm that managed to topple the town's studio and kill 2 horses. So who placed the orders for the antiques? It's not like anyone lives at the address, which is why the group takes up residence there. Most of this comes down to the game's reliance on magical realism, a genre which allows for giant birds flying houses back and forth across miles of open terrain every morning and every night, or a non-Euclidean network of tunnels running in relative secrecy underneath the very public Kentucky highways, which Conway, an experienced driver, had no knowledge of before the events of the game. It doesn't explain itself because these kinds of stories are usually focused on things other than world building, while also adding a special charm wherein bizarre things can happen at any point in the story. And I'd like to make it clear that that list of plot holes is not criticism, but just a point on what the game focuses on. So what about characters? It's true that Kentucky Route Zero does come with a large cast of main characters that get a lot of screen time, but I think there are 2 things that hold it back from really having a focus on its characters. The first would be how static these characters seem to be. There doesn't seem to be any revelatory moment for any of these characters that set them on a new path or significantly change their personalities. Conway remains a stereotypically southern, laid-back truck driver from his first moments on screen to the point where he's taken from Shannon near the end of Act 4. Ezra remains a playful child with a childlike view of his world, just wanting to be around his new friends. Junebug maintains her glamorous show business attitude when talking to anyone, with Johnny never leaving her side. The only exception to this is Shannon, who is clearly shaken up by Conway being taken away to work at the distillery. Her normally jokey yet pragmatically driven character is drained from her, as is expressed through the song "This World Is Not My Home," playing as she goes back to the boat, alone and without a bite to eat from the restaurant. However, this is the exception and not the rule, and I can't say it's particularly interesting on top of that. The other point about characters is that, while there is a large cast, many of the characters get relatively little time to develop because the game's act and scene structure is built as a series of vignettes of varying lengths. Act 4 is the clearest example of this, with each scene introducing new characters like the gas station clerk, the 2 workers at the Radvansky Center, and the phone operator, and just as quickly abandoning them. They are remarkably well realized as characters despite their lack of time on screen, but I still couldn't say this makes characterization a major focus. And when the vignette structure is used, usually the story is trying to draw connections between the smaller stories told within in order to create something larger. That something larger is theme, which is where Kentucky Route Zero is truly exceptional. In the old abandoned mine past the off-ramp, Shannon expects to find something. Her parents worked in this mine for the ever-prominent power company that seems to control most of Kentucky's industry. Before leaving the mine with Conway on the tram, she says she needs to look around a little more first. And deep inside a cramped tunnel, she finds a pile of hard hats buried underneath a pile of caved-in rubble. Kentucky Route Zero is, quite obviously, set in Kentucky, which is, for many people living in more urbanized areas of the US, one of the states which is most symbolic of the eastern US and the Rust Belt. The inefficient rural infrastructure is displayed in thorough detail across the many near-abandoned locations and winding roads that only branch out further into a pointlessly complex web. Kentucky's surface has been practically wiped clean of any independent business, requiring a journey beneath the surface to escape this failing world. A single entity represents capitalist interest across Kentucky, the pervasive yet elusive power company. It began with the mining industry, with the iron and steel industries specifically being among the main calling cards of the early Rust Belt. They paid their employees in company tokens to spend in company stores, and caused the deaths of numerous miners due to their negligence, including Shannon's parents. A memorial to the workers who lost their lives can be found just before the Bat Sanctuary on the Echo River, which has some choice words for the company. After the mining boom died down, they expanded out through the rest of Kentucky's surface, placing things like the phone lines and the pharmaceutical industry in their pocket. They also seem to own the Hard Times Distillery, which offers predatory loans to bar owners and tricks others into an unpayable debt, which has them working as a replacement for a previous employee who passed away on the job. They transform their workers into faceless facsimiles of their former selves, promoting conformity with their formula, which they follow with an almost cult-like zeal. The power company, as a whole, is a representation of the driving forces behind Kentucky's disrepair, and the reason why people like Conway and Shannon have to resort to searching for a new home, and a new future. Conway, specifically, is the character whose story most reflects this side of the game. The delivery he's making is for a failing antique store, his final delivery, another small business absorbed in the changing times of increasing industrialization. The owner, Lisette, only appears in one scene, a sunny and idealized flashback from just before Conway set out on his delivery. That flashback is what Act 3 begins with, and it's what Conway is remembering after his dose of medicine, the event which truly sets his fate in motion. As he takes his dose of Neuropinol TM, the house appears to ripple apart as his doctor tells him about his bill from a company that just acquired his employer, the power company. When he wakes up, his leg isn't really his. In fact, it looks like it came straight off one of the distillery workers. It's a visual representation of Conway's medical bills. Now, the power company owns that part of him. Next is the distillery, where Conway is tricked into even further debt to the power company. They see him wandering around, without a job and looking for somewhere to settle down, and they see someone who can easily be conscripted. Conway has no power over any of it, as is illustrated by the game taking control of the cursor to drink the top-shelf shift drink, which is what really seals Conway's debt even further. In Act 4, Conway has another limb replaced, and the game never gives away control of him either. Even when the camera focuses on him, the player can never control him like they once could, further illustrating his debt and his imminent departure from the story that began with him. And when he is taken, that's it. He's really gone forever. It's actually really uncanny how much he's gone. He's not even talked about during Act 5 by anyone. The only memory left of him is the delivery that set the other characters down this road. Because of this, Conway never gets to join his companions in building their new home at 5 Dogwood Drive. He has no agency over his situation. That's the important word here, agency. In Kentucky Route Zero's world, agency is a resource and a luxury, a reality for which the power company is at fault. Through their methods of obtaining new workers, they strip agency from those who already have little through debt. Since Kentucky is ripe with people like Conway, it can happen to anyone, it can happen without warning, and they might not even have a choice in the matter. And once you've been sucked into the system, there's no way out. The only way to obtain the luxury of agency is to get lucky and find a place that will accept you. This happens to be reflected in the relationship between the player and the game. Kentucky Route Zero is not a particularly choicey game. There are choices to be made, but finding a single choice that impacts even the smallest of outcomes is difficult. No matter what you do, or what decisions you make in dialogue, the game always has the same ending. Only very minor adjustments are made throughout the game for very select choices, like a small paper boat floating down a river, or deciding between keeping a 20-sided die or leaving it on a table. Just like how the characters' fates are left up to the system present in their world, the player's experience of the game is left up to the game itself. And while it's unfair, it's no one's fault. An act of God. That's what you call it. That's what you say when it's no one's fault. Kentucky Route Zero never shows us even a glimpse of the people who run this world. Not the higher-ups in the power company, or the inventor of the formula. They don't, because both the game's world and the real world are not run by individuals. They are run by systems. Systems that are unfair and unjust, ready to capitalize on everyone living within them. Though it doesn't have to be that way. Just like how individuals create systems, they are also the only ones that can make change to them as well. It may take lifetimes for change to come, but it will always be worth it when it does. But Kentucky Route Zero obviously does not perfectly map onto reality. The system which runs this world is not so easily malleable as ours, and even that's saying something. So in a world such as this, the only way out is to build your own system, build your own community. At the end of Act 5, a funeral is held by the current residents of the town for their horses. They saw the horses as their equals. They didn't give them names because they were not theirs to give. They were the only things left of the group who set the foundations for their town, a group only known as the People of Nothing. As the town's poet Nikki presides over the graves, she says, "I guess some of us might stay and build again. That's alright. It couldn't be me, but to try is your birthright. If you do stay, you'll be building on top of a grave. But that's true anywhere. The whole world is built on top of graves. Look for me under your boot soles." And afterwards comes a song.
I've heard of a land of joy and peace and wonderful life, a beautiful place of mansions fair and skies so bright, where all who believe the Savior dear forever shall stay. And having been saved by grace divine, I'm going that way.
In Kentucky Route Zero, there are two types of people: those who have found their homes, and those who wander the world looking for theirs. We hear about Conway's introduction to the wandering lifestyle as he drifts into daydreaming at the distillery. He sat in his car and went over some options. Chicago, Toronto, Barrow. It seemed like a bold and impulsive gesture at the time. As he pulled out of the parking lot, he removed his hand from the steering wheel for a moment and felt the car drift into a decision. Years later, he'd think of this as the moment he himself started drifting. Conway knows that, now that he's on his last delivery for the business he's been so attached to for these years, he needs to find a new place to go. His journey across and even underneath Kentucky takes on a dual purpose, not just to fulfill his obligation, but to find a new home. However, the forces of industrialization and automation have clearly exacerbated themselves since the last time he was out of a job. Finding people with a stable platform with which they can support themselves on Kentucky's surface roads is an incredibly rare occurrence. What few locations you're able to visit on the surface roads include a failing bar, an abandoned farmstead, and a near-empty gas station with a single employee who lounges around all day. So because of this, I'd say it's no coincidence that Conway is directed towards the Zero. It's the only place in close proximity that hasn't crumbled under the weight of the power company's presence. Below Kentucky's surface roads, you can find many small and strange, but very much alive communities of people. The counterintuitive navigational strategies that need to be employed on the Zero allow small communities like the group of kids acting out court cases to survive on the Zero, even though the power company has their foot well in the door with places like the distillery. There are even some projects being sustained by the Zero's roads, like the Rust Archives and, most notably, Donald and his crew creating Xanadu. And when you start to go along the Echo River, the diversity of communities only grows. Act 4 takes so much time compared to the other acts because the game is putting an emphasis on them. From the sandy shores and cocktail-fueled nights of the rum colony, the chatty interns at the Radvansky Center, or Salmonidas providing a central hub for those who live along the river, as well as those who are just passing through. You might even argue the entire river to be one big community, with the Mucky Mammoth connecting all the separate bits together. However, it's clear that the power company has begun to reach into the river, having acquired the central exchange and using that to pull Conway out so he can get to his new job. Thus, in Shannon's eyes, this world is not her home. Which brings us to the town in Act 5. A town that survived on the surface because it can't be reached by following a road, with its members using flight to get around. The power company once tried to claim it as a company town, but, according to Nikki, after that we became ungovernable, first out of shame, then grief, then anger. The town was thriving just the day before the storm hit, but still the townsfolk's reverence for their work and creating something separate from the power company keeps their spirits alive, even if only for just one more day. This is communicated visually as well, with a far more vibrant color palette being employed compared to other locations that are visited throughout the game, and more vibrant and natural instrumentation employed in the music as well. This town is the final stop for the group that Conway and Shannon picked up along the roads, and it's the destination of Conway's delivery at 5 Dogwood Drive. An impossible structure that simply appeared here one day out of thin air. It's a spit in the face of narrative consistency and reasonable suspension of disbelief, while also being the game's most important symbol. If Conway's final delivery is a metaphor for the journey to find a home to settle into and a community to which you belong, then the building at 5 Dogwood Drive is that home and community. A blank building, without furniture, without lights, without any doors even. A blank slate. Each character sees something different. Shannon sees a new workshop to fix electronics in. Both Junebug and Johnny see a stage, a place to hold performances of their music. They all see it as a place to settle and begin again, which is exactly what Dogwood Drive symbolizes. Now, while the future of this town might be the game's focus here, it also doesn't shy away from exploring its past and how it relates to its future. The first group to settle at the town are known today as the People of Nothing. Not much is really known about them, but what's important is what they represent. Throughout Act 5, you can find these ghostly figures walking around, figures representing the people that preceded the town's current residents. You can discover many important memories from these people's history, from the initial journey to the town's current site, to experiments taking place in the library, to even recent memories of a member known to the current inhabitants who passed away. The important concept is that this town's history spans generations of separate groups that came one after the other and left their mark on the land. Shannon and her group are just another in a long line of past communities which built upon this land. So it's interesting that the game drops little hints about the nature of time in its world. Firstly, if Conway takes the glow-in-the-dark die with him when he finds it in Act 1, Shannon finds it in her pocket in Act 5, and gives it back to the people that were supposedly playing the game in the basement of the gas station. There's also the strange design of the main menu, with all the options arranged in a circle, always slowly spinning. The idea is that the nature of the game's world is cyclical, not that there will always be a man named Conway who picks up a TV repairwoman, an orphan child, and a couple of musicians on his way to 5 Dogwood Drive to deliver antiques, but rather the concepts of the settled and the wanderers, the power company preying on small communities, and the group of wanderers looking for a home will be what repeats throughout time. In that way, time is a flat circle, which will repeat until the paradigm shifts. All the people who came to the town before Shannon's group, and all the people who will come after, are all a part of this unceasing loop. That's why what Nikki says at the neighbor's funeral is so important. The whole world is built on top of graves is true because of the cyclical nature of the world, with people settling a site, dying or being driven out, just in time for another group to take their place. When it comes to the people whose graves you build upon, you can practice reverence and respect for those who came before you, or you can pave over it like the power company did in transforming the site into just another company town. The correct choice should be obvious. Thus, look for me under your boot soles.
I've heard of a land of joy and peace and wonderful life.
The song sung at the funeral, I'm Going That Way, is a song for and about the people who wander in search of a new home. It's about hearing of a beautiful and prosperous land that will take you in, and the urge to go that way. It's a feeling that was felt at some point by every group who took up residence in the town. This is why, as the song goes on, the ghosts of all the town's previous occupants gather around the grave, joining in singing along about their shared emotion, the human drive to find community.
And never to stray, just singing praises all day long. I'm going that way.
I'd like to wrap up this section by talking about religion. Considering that the game lifts from American folk music, Christianity is bound to come up eventually. 4 out of the 5 folk songs included in the game make mention of Jesus, heaven, or a savior. Now, say what you will about organized religion, but religious thought starts as a way to bring people together under a unified code and faith in something greater than themselves. And while that faith has historically been morphed into something which is harmful to society, until it undergoes that transformation, it is a community. A group of like-minded people working together to sustain each other. The many avenues by which the game tackles the idea of community, whether that be religion, the concept of one's home, or even the psychological drive to seek it out, are all very well thought out and nuanced, as I've hopefully communicated by now. But, surprisingly, I still have more to discuss. Around the start of Act 5, there is a conversation between Shannon, Clara, and Maya, all 3 of them new arrivals in the town. Maya, in particular, was there for when the town's community television studio was torn down by the storm, though at this point, she just says she's here to sketch what the town's earliest settlers left in the way of art. The focus of this conversation, in particular, is the centerpiece of the town, which goes by many names. Maya calls it an ancient earthwork, Shannon sees it as a dirt spiral, the game itself calls it an earthwork path in this achievement description. But I think Maya puts it most eloquently when she says, it's all art. It's all just art. If you've played Kentucky Route Zero before watching this video, it's possible, and maybe even probable, that you've been annoyed with me for avoiding a specific topic, the intermissions. 5 self-contained, non-essential, but still very much supplemental scenes that connect the 5 acts together. They seem to be mostly in service of the plot, as the contents of each intermission foreshadows events and characters featured in the following act. Limits and Demonstrations is an art gallery of the works of Lula Chamberlain, who is a character introduced in Act 2. In fact, the act opens on her reading a rejection letter about her work. The Entertainment is a play which takes place in the bar scene in Act 3, even going so far as to name-drop Junebug as the performance for the titular entertainment. Here and there along the Echo is a guide to the Echo River, which is the setting for Act 4. Un Pueblo de Nada, or in English, The People of Nothing, takes place in the studio used by the members of the town in Act 5, which is torn down by the harsh storm at the end of the scene. And the last one? I'll save that for later. There are a lot of interesting connections to art in Kentucky Route Zero. A simple one is the ability of art to predict future events. There are 3 main examples of this, with the most obvious being Xanadu. Donald says that, before its ruin, it was faultless as an oracle, a shrine to perfect simulation. This fits with Xanadu's ability to predict Lula's arrival when the group uses it. A second example would be the Entertainment, which, as discussed earlier, foreshadows the bar featured in Act 3, Junebug's entrance into the story, and even the prevalence of the power company, as one of their workers appears at the end of the scene to collect the bar's debt. The last example would come from Act 5, through one of the more prevalent members of the People of Nothing. Throughout the act, you can find memories of earlier residents of the town, with the most common name being the Seer. This person created a game, which allowed the People of Nothing to find the site that they would eventually build the town on. The motif of art predicting the future seems to mainly be in service of portraying the power of art, a power which underlies every work found within the game. When viewed through the lens of art, many elements of Kentucky Route Zero seem to coalesce in the celebration of all art, of all types from every medium. For example, think about the game itself. It models itself after the point-and-click adventures of the LucasArts era, with an art style which highlights each individual pixel which makes up the image, but it also takes a lot from many other mediums. Many of the descriptions found when examining things in-game sound like they came right out of a novel, while character dialogue is stylized like a movie script, even down to the font choice. And this is all while the game is making allusions to several stage plays, even featuring its own inside the game in the form of the entertainment. The game's soundtrack also contains a range of genres, from the American folk tunes to the atmospheric electronic pieces, with some other songs like Riverworld being a fusion of the two. It's a unique and remarkably successful mixture of genres, mediums, and art forms. However, to discuss this part of the game, I need to introduce a character that I haven't mentioned yet. During Act 1, immediately after leaving the gas station, you can re-enter it and find this guy talking to Joseph. This is Carrington, and he's looking for a venue to host his experimental theater production of the Robert Frost poem, The Death of the Hired Man. After meeting him here at the gas station, he can be found later in the game in a few spots. During the opening of Act 2, he talks to Lula about finding a venue, and later can be directed towards a few different locations by Conway. He can be found at that location during Act 3, preparing for the big night. He also calls Shannon during Act 4 for advice about how to incorporate light into his production. But obviously, the most important thing to do with Carrington is the final intermission, Death of the Hired Man, which is only unlocked if you find him at the gas station in Act 1. It's named after the Robert Frost poem, and stars Carrington and the owner of the bar from Act 3, Harry, talking about a number of things, like Carrington's failed stage play, to which no one attended, or their interpretations of a few lines from The Death of the Hired Man. But aside from being another medium that the game pays homage to, the scene also seems to be a retelling of the poem itself, with the two characters discussing a third, younger character who is only barely able to hold a job, though it doesn't end so morbidly with the death of the hired man. There are even some lines lifted directly from the poem to really cement this. It's interesting because the death of the hired man, both the poem and the in-game scene, seem to wrap up the themes presented by the game very eloquently. The hired man, only barely surviving and in need of respite from the world and his troubles, comes back to a previous employer who only begrudgingly takes him in despite also being a victim of this world's system. The discussion of the meaning of the word home is a clear parallel to the game's fixation on community. Home is the place where, when you have to go there, they have to take you in. For many in Kentucky, their community is their home. It's the place that has to take them in. But the way it tackles the themes of art is something that I, once again, have to save for later. Instead, let me draw attention to a quote from Carrington from earlier in the game. Carrington is here at the Bureau of Reclaimed Spaces. The Bureau does its best to repurpose old and abandoned sites for new purposes, and speaking on this mission, Carrington says, "You do important work here now. Maybe it's not sublime art, but it's... Do you know the famous dramatist who visited Mexico and said, 'Here there is no art, things are made for use'? Think about the term sublime art. Art is an infamously malleable word, and it's exactly this malleability that Kentucky Route Zero capitalizes on. The game has a philosophy on what art is, and it's a philosophy of radical inclusivity. While there are very traditionally accepted forms of art portrayed in the game under the umbrella term of sublime art, they aren't the only forms that the game believes in. This is what things like the Bureau represent. What the Bureau does is art. The restaurant on the Echo River, Salmonitas, that's art. The Bat Sanctuary is art. The TV station ran by the town is art. Everything is art. That art is powerful, and it can save people. It is made for use. The only thing that the game really excludes from being art is the power company and all of its predatory practices, because it isn't saving anyone. In fact, it's actively harmful to this world. It's not made for use. And that's the other quote. Here there is no art, things are made for use. This line is strange in its negative connotation when speaking on art, and I think this ties in with another motif the game presents, the inhumanity of art. If you think about what art is, it's an all-encompassing medium through which people can express and evoke emotions for another person. It's a mechanism of communication, and unless it's a story being orated, it cannot be tailored on the fly to be more suitable to an audience. Art will not change for you. Xanadu doesn't really change the future, and it will simply tell it in all its inconveniency and disappointment. In Limits and Demonstrations, there is an interactive piece with branching paths that changes what audio the audience hears next, but every conclusion it can end on is so similar that they may as well be the same ending. The same concept is also reflected in the game as a whole. So many choices in dialogue, so many little secret bits hidden away just out of view, but changing what the characters say or what they do will never change the story in a significant way. It always ends the same way. It will not change for you. In this way, art is a very cold and uncaring thing, so that's why it's important that the game always shows the artist. After seeing Lula's work in Limits and Demonstrations, the game shows her working at the Bureau, and she becomes a fully fleshed out character. You meet Donald long before seeing his work in the form of Xanadu. The narrator behind Here and There Along the Echo works on the boat the group takes in Act 4. Un Pueblo de Nada is less focused on the broadcast created in the studio than it is on the people who make that broadcast happen. As it turns out, the game isn't really a celebration of the art itself, it's rather a celebration of the people which art serves, both the artist and the audience. Art is something that tricks us into thinking it carries some level of humanity inside of it, when in reality, all that meaning is not intrinsic to it. Rather, it's something that the artist designs, and the audience injects their own meaning into based on their own experiences. And this is what Kentucky Route Zero is about. Maybe. There's an interesting little secret in Kentucky Route Zero's pause menu under an option labeled Multiplayer. Play until you encounter something, an image, a sound, a choice of words, a notable absence, that reminds you of someone else in the room. Pass control of the game to that person. You don't have to explain yourself. And so on. While I've spent most of my time going over theme throughout the runtime of this video, themes are simply building blocks through which we can reach our own individual interpretation. We can say that Kentucky Route Zero invokes the eastern US Rust Belt region and uses it to make points on capitalist interest by pointing to how the game portrays the power company and their actions in-game. This is something that we can point to with some level of objectivity, with a claim backed by evidence. However, the interpretation of the work that an individual comes out the other end with is not so objective. It will depend on the individual's background, tastes, interests, and their entire life leading up to that point. What a work has to say is far less objective, and it's less that it has something to say, and more like the audience is seeing some part of themselves in the work and perceiving that that part speaks to them. Throughout the text of Kentucky Route Zero, you can find several examples of the game promoting individual interpretation of the works found within the game. Limits and Demonstrations, for example, is a literal art gallery that 3 characters tour, giving their thoughts on the work found within to each other. The characters draw connections and comparisons to poems they've read, each other, and their own emotions they instinctively have when looking at it. During the entertainment, the player can look around to find excerpts from newspapers with reviews of the entertainment, pointing out its strengths and commenting on its flaws. Actually, a lot of the dialogue found in the game follows the formula of identifying a connection to previous events in the characters' lives and talking through their emotions. Take this part in Act 4, for example. Conway and Shannon pass a memorial to the victims of the cave-ins on their way to deliver the package to the Echo River Central Exchange. The player is shown the text of the memorial in full. Conway points out that this was the mine they went through all the way back in Act 1, and they talk through Shannon's feelings about her parents being among the people who died in the mines. However, the clearest example of this is the death of the hired man. At a certain point in this scene, the Robert Frost poem is brought up. Carrington brings up one of the poem's more interesting lines. Home is the place where, when you have to go there, they have to take you in. He asks Harry if it means anything to you, and they discuss their interpretations, with Harry thinking of a connection to Christianity and the grace of God. Near the end, a third character, Emily, chimes in with her interpretation. She doesn't think the description fits the concept of home, and rather, the place where, when you have to go there, they have to take you in, is a grave. And this is where I personally find meaning in Kentucky Route Zero. As someone who really enjoys digging into stories and art in general to find my own meaning in them, Kentucky Route Zero is one of the strongest pieces when it comes to discovering individual meaning, because it's something that the game actively encourages through its writing. In a way, this is the real game that every part of the game is leading up to. Playing the game itself is not particularly fun, or at least it wasn't for me. The real game begins when you have enough information to start forming your own meaning around the work. The fun of the game is in putting together as much of the game's text into as comprehensive a reading as you can manage. For example, here is a potential reading that I thought up. What if the whole game was an analogy for the foundational early stages and evolution of the internet? While it's still much more common for people to use the surface roads to communicate and collect information, the Zero is a network that, with the right knowledge, one can dial into, accessing a hidden world whose presentation takes inspiration from vector displays, a callback to old computers, and the relatively primitive games built on them. Along the Zero lie communities of strangely specific interests that range from different types of Rust in the Rust archives, to documenting memory degradation at the Radvansky Center, to the Bureau representing a compromise between a strange interest holding a community together and professional formalities with chains of bureaucracy. However, as this underground network permeates and grows in scope, the power company begins to take notice, and they seek to put the Zero and all its history back in line with their status quo. It's the difference between the early esoteric form structure of the early internet and the current age where large companies profit off gaining more users on more generalist social networks. This is but one of the many ways you might coherently organize the text into meaning, but the real beauty behind Kentucky Route Zero is that it isn't the only way. When a piece is so dense in its text, offering up so many different parts to see oneself in, there is bound to be more than just one way to organize the text into an interpretation. The way you end up interpreting the text will depend on your own background and interests. If you find interest in art history, you might connect with the many references and homages the game makes to other works, and how that might fit in with tightening its themes. You might be able to give explanations for some of the game's more bewildering aspects that I simply could not, like what purpose Weaver serves to the story and its ideas, or why you can hypnotize Shannon by facing her towards the camera during this scene in the mine, which is apparently worthy of an achievement, or why Junebug and Johnny are actually androids, for whatever reason. You might take interest in the game's architecture, and how it oftentimes seems to break apart or fall away during important moments, which is reflected in dialogue like, "Do you think we're inside or outside right now?" A few lines I saw a lot of myself in are from Act 4, one from the clerk at the gas station, "I've learned to cherish it. There's dignity in being forgotten, letting the crowd flow around you unspoiled," and another from Will on the way to the group's final stop on the Echo River, "It's no shame to be forgotten." And finally, you might not find anything to connect to in the game. You may think the game doesn't really have much to say, and while I would contest that this point of view is somewhat narrow-minded, it's still a valid way to view the game on a personal level. That's the reason I appended the title of this video with "Maybe," because when talking about meaning in art, there are very rarely any absolutes. It's going to depend on your background and what you have an eye for, so everyone will come out with a different idea of what this game is about. It's a very strong quality for a piece to have, in my opinion, when everyone who sees it comes out interpreting it differently. But since I cannot tell you what this game, or any piece, means to you, I think that even if you watch this whole video before playing the game, you might still find something to appreciate in it, because I think Kentucky Route Zero is all about discovering your own meaning in its chaotic and confusing structure. In that respect, this game is absolutely exceptional. It's one of the most meticulously and confidently constructed games ever made, and it deserves your time. That is what Kentucky Route Zero is about. Maybe.